Yo, what's going on guys? Arekkz here, welcome back to another Monster Hunter World video. Following on from the video that I uploaded this morning, showing you guys all 14 weapons in action, it is now time to dive a little bit deeper and break down exactly what it is we saw during these clips. I'm also going to be grouping the weapons a little bit differently to how I did this morning. You see, since the Japanese videos have gone live, the English versions have also dropped, and for the West, Capcom have opted to group all the weapons into one of three categories: light, heavy, and technical. Light weapons consist of sword and shield, dual blade, longsword, and light bowgun. Heavy weapons are greatsword, lance, gunlance, hammer, and heavy bowgun. And technical weapons are charge blade, switch axe, hunting horn, bow, and insect glaive, which is actually a pretty cool way to group them, especially if you are new to Monster Hunter, since it gives you a kind of broader idea as to roughly where the weapons belong. So if you have, say, a preferred playstyle from similar games, then that might well influence the direction that you go. Ultimately, when the game comes out, I would encourage checking out all the weapons because they each bring something special to the table, but it's only natural that you'll gravitate towards a few favourites. For me, the technical category is definitely home to most of my favourite weapons, but I'll speak more about that at the end of the video. For now, let's get started breaking these down. Of course, if you do enjoy this, then a like would be super appreciated, and be sure to comment down below and let me know what you guys think. Now, to begin with, let's talk about the sword and shield. This is, as the subtitles say on screen, a great weapon if you are new to the series. Great weapon for beginners. Doesn't mean to say it is only a beginner weapon. On the contrary, sword and shield is one of my favourite weapons, and I've had extensive time using this throughout a number of different Monster Hunter titles. However, what makes it so good if you are new to the series is that it is a fast, nimble weapon. You can kind of get in, do some quick attacks, and get out. You have a shield to protect yourself, and more importantly, it is the only weapon of the 14 that allows you to use items whilst your weapon is drawn. Typically, if you want to use things like potions, well done stakes, antidotes, or traps, you have to put your weapon away, whereas sword and shield, you can use it whilst your weapon is drawn. This is of course very good because if you are, again, new to the series, you are perhaps fighting a monster you're not familiar with, you've taken some damage, then sometimes the sort of motion to put your weapon away can leave you open for a little bit too long to the point where you then get hit and killed. So having that flexibility to use items on the go is very, very nice. And of course in Monster Hunter World, there's also the introduction of the slinger, the arm-mounted cannon that you use to fire pellets and seeds to damage and distract the monster, or fire at your grapple to grapple onto environmental hooks, things like that, and that can of course also be used whilst your weapon is drawn if you're using the sword and shield. So that in itself is very good, plus one of the things about Monster Hunter is of course learning the monsters that you're fighting, learning their move patterns, learning how they behave, and again, if you've never fought that monster before, then a sword and shield is a very handy way to learn that monster, because you do have a shield to protect yourself, and while it might not be the strongest shield in the game, it does of course allow you to hide behind it if you're in a sort of sticky situation, and you can then kind of use that to learn the monster, and then as you begin to get better, you can then use that less and less. However, on top of that, a couple of things I want to call out. This move here appears to be the kind of new variation of the advancing move. Typically, this is either a draw attack or your kind of double button press attack for sword and shield, and in previous games, this is the one where you kind of like lunge forward and slice your sword down, but this time around it seems to have a rising attack instead, so that's pretty cool. It's followed with a shield bash, and the second one is that the sword and shield has a charge attack you can typically work in after combos, and this one seems that if you connect with a monster, it then goes into an aerial sort of launch, which they then follow up with a downward thrust shield attack. Now of course any damage dealt with the shield is impact damage, so it can be KO damage, so that could be a great and kind of fun way to KO the monster. But more importantly, the fact that you kind of have this aerial launch of the monster, I'm interested to see whether that then gives you the potential to go straight into a mount. Of course, don't forget that in Monster Hunter World, arts and styles are not coming back, but it seems like what they have done is taken some of the sort of inspiration, some of the sort of fan favourites from some of those weapons and woven some kind of generation feels into some of these weapons. So that is pretty sweet. Now moving on from there to the dual blades, another set of fast attacking weapons. These are, in previous Monster Hunter games, great at inflicting status damage or elemental damage given the speed at which they attack. Now one of the cool features of the dual blades is of course your ability to dip into demon mode, and when you're in this stance you attack faster, you can dish out more damage, and in World they've actually changed your stance when you are in this mode. Typically you hold your weapons vertically, the blades, but as soon as you enter demon mode, you actually flip them backwards. Now, I appreciate when I've mentioned this in the past, some people have said this doesn't really make sense, it's not really a viable way to use blades, and maybe that's the case, but it does still look pretty cool. Another move we also got to look at is the ability to, if you do a spinning move off of a ledge, this is something that was present in previous Monster Hunter games, you then have the ability to kind of like launch yourself off the ledge into effectively like a spinning top attack. However, in World, it seems that this attack has two kind of segments to it. There's like the first spin, and then there's a second follow-up spin. So we see it in the intro sequence where they kind of go right then forward, and of course in the second sequence where they actually attack the monster, there's the initial spin off the ledge, and then a secondary follow-up spin that goes down the back of the monster. So that looks pretty damn awesome. Now moving on from there to the longsword, it's kind of in the name, it is a longer weapon, you have more reach with this. The kind of core moveset for this is pretty basic. You have sort of down attacks, you have your stab attack, and of course you have your rising attack. The other component of the longsword is of course the spirit gauge. So whenever you attack, you build up a spirit meter. You won't see it in this gameplay because they've hidden the UI, but typically you build up a spirit meter and you can then go into spirit attacks. And when you land the final spirit attack, that'll then effectively give you a glow to your weapon. Now, it's a lot more subtle in Monster Hunter World when compared to previous games, hence why in the past, in the sort of gameplay we've seen, it wasn't actually that clear as to whether that glow is present. It definitely is, you can kind of see it subtly on the sword, but once you land the last attack of your spirit attack, you then level up your gauge. You begin by getting a white glow on your blade, and then it goes yellow and red. So assuming that still remains the same in Monster Hunter World, then the different levels of glow, of course, affect the damage output as well. So good use of the longsword, of course, revolves around your basic attacks paired with your spirit attacks. However, one of the cool things in World seems to be this new almost sort of counter attack. So you'll see in this stance here, he does like this rising attack and then gets hit and then dashes backwards. Now that reminds me heavily of Brave style from Monster Hunter Double Cross. And of course, following that, he then goes into this absolutely awesome new move where he stabs forward, basically runs up the side of the monster, slams down, and then there's this big vertical slice attack, which then follows up with, I'm assuming some kind of shockwave, because in the gameplay, it looks like it's a little bit too far away, so the hitbox for this is either very generous or there was some kind of behind-the-scenes editing in this, but either way, that is some kind of Rurouni Kenshin style longsword play. Then finally, for the light section, we have the light bowgun. Now, in truth, I've never really been a huge fan of bowguns in the past. I know how to use them. I've typically kind of taken my time to learn how to use the weapons just because I like to kind of know about them, but I've never really been a huge fan of bowguns. However, this time around, the way they move around, you seem to be a lot more mobile, generally speaking, using bowguns. They almost kind of have this sort of third-person shooter-style camera, which I'm personally a pretty big fan of. I appreciate if you guys are gunners, you might have a different opinion on this, but the general sort of fluidity of the gun looks really cool. You seem to be able to have this ability to sort of dash and slide while you're attacking. You, of course, have a variety of different bullets at your disposal, plus there's actually this really cool new move where he pokes his gun in the ground and basically seems to plant what I'm going to kind of call like C4 charges or like explosive charges. He then shoots them and they then seem to kind of just like constantly trigger off these explosions. So if you imagine like a team of people doing this and laying that down on the ground, maybe pair it with a trap, you could probably dish out some pretty nasty damage. Now moving on from there to the heavy weapon category, starting with the greatsword. I'm going to try and be pretty brief with this one because we have seen a lot of the greatsword already. In fact, it's probably the weapon we've seen the most of in the Monster Hunter World gameplay. Long story short, the greatsword is a big, powerful weapon. It is slow, or you'll be slow whilst wielding it, but it does have, of course, the ability to kick out some serious damage. Of course, one of the main new moves we've seen from this is this ability to sort of work a shoulder charge into various different parts of your combo, and when you actually look at the impact or the kind of particle effects when you actually attack the monster, this clearly does impact damage. So I'd imagine if the monster is near enough to the threshold, then you could actually KO the monster with a shoulder charge, which is kind of cool. It also seems like you can work that charge into a variety of different scenarios. You can see in this case, the hunter is charging the greatsword, which is of course one of the most iconic moves of this weapon, but instead of actually going straight into the charge, he then cancels that into a shoulder charge, and then instead goes into a follow-up charge using what looks like the strong charge animation. So again, assuming this is similar to previous Monster Hunter games, then that is, of course, something you can kind of go into from there. You'll also notice that the actual charge animations do look different. You no longer have kind of a flash on your weapon on your character. You instead have this red glow that sort of envelops your character. This is something you'll also see on different weapons, the bow, the hammer, other things like that. So that'll, of course, be what you watch out for when trying to work out what level of charge you are at. And of course, rounding it out, there is this brand new charge move we've seen that again appears to follow the strong charge, where you charge up the sword like this, you basically do sort of like a cartwheel attack. So it actually comes in sort of two parts. You do the first slam, you then flip over, do another slam, and of course, looking at the effects on the weapon, it appears to kind of maintain that charge level all the way through the entire attack. So more than likely, pretty good damage. After that, jumping over to the Lance. Now, if you guys have played Monster Hunter before, then Lance, at least from the kind of gameplay they've shown here, doesn't look drastically different. It actually kind of behaves essentially how you've always expected a Lance to behave. You have your standard kind of 3 stab attacks. Now, for Lance, that can either be kind of forward or slightly kind of raised upwards. You have your shield, which is of course great for blocking a lot of attacks. Lance has one of the strongest shields in the game, and it is kind of considerably different to a lot of the other weapons. For those of you guys kind of that are getting into Monster Hunter for the first time, Lance and Gunlance are much more weapons where you kind of like stand there, take the brunt of the attack, and sort of, you know, counter your attacks and then move forward. So you're kind of like this sort of impenetrable wall that just stands at the front. Whereas a lot of other weapons, you'll kind of get in, you'll do your attacks, and then you'll dodge out. Lance is much more about just like standing your ground. So with that, it's typically a little bit kind of like more clunky to move because you don't necessarily have the sort of fluidity to run around like other weapons, but your powerful shield is effectively what allows you to play in this way. So for the most part, moves are, again, pretty standard. You have your stabs, you have your back hops, your triple back hop. We see the counter attack here, so of course the monster goes into attack and you then follow that up with a stab. And we also have the other cool move for the Lance, where you can basically run forward and sort of do this long charging attack. And you can then, of course, jump from that, and that can go into a mount. As we see at the very end, he then jumps and actually starts landing on the side of the monster and, of course, hacking on his face. So, pretty cool. Nothing kind of drastically new there. Do, of course, bear in mind that all the moves you're seeing here are only, of course, going to be like a snippet, because these are 30-second teasers. And, of course, you know, looking at previous Monster Hunter games, a lot of the weapons, even some of the more basic ones that don't have, like, too many moves, they still have other kind of intricacies to them. So this is definitely much more of like a teaser to kind of give us a taste of what the weapons have to offer. So it doesn't mean to say that Lance doesn't have anything new. It just means that based on kind of what we've seen so far, it still looks kind of similar to what we know. Either way, moving on from there to the next one, the Gunlance. Similar sort of situation in that it is another one of those kind of like, you know, stand your ground, be sort of an iron wall. It's got a very strong shield. The differing factor for those of you guys that are new is that you also have effectively a gun worked into your lance. You can then stab using the kind of lance component, but you can also fire off these shells to dish out some additional damage. One of the new things in Monster Hunter World, and this is so unbelievably over the top, it just had me laughing when I first saw this, is that in this part, they kind of stab this shell into the monster's head, and then it gets stuck in its head, and it detonates a few seconds later. So not only are you firing off shells, not only are you able to kind of like, you know, slam the ground and kind of unload all your shells, but you can also impale a shell in the monster's head and just give him a headache a little bit later. So that's pretty cool, and of course after that we get a look at the Wyvern Fire attack. Next up, enter the KO King, the hammer. This is another weapon close to my heart. I love the hammer. And in World, just sort of like, it looks really, really cool. And plus, just the sounds, like when you actually listen to the clips, if you guys haven't seen them, then I'll link the video I uploaded earlier today, which is just the sort of video clips playing out in the background without me talking over the top, so you can actually hear the sounds. But hearing this weapon hit just sounds so incredibly awesome. Now, as the weapon goes, it's always had a pretty basic moveset. You either kind of have your typical sort of triple pound gold swing, or you have like a few other variations. In this gameplay, we of course see the charge attack. Once again, that sort of red glow effect developing the hunter kind of carries through. We saw from the Japanese gameplay, you seem to have this ability to sort of shift your charge into the head of the hammer. It's not shown in this gameplay, but if you guys saw my video a while back, we saw that in the Japanese gameplay. But one of the really cool things, and this is a new move, is this like over the top sort of stress ball kind of move where you basically just sort of like keep pounding on the monster's head. It seems like every single hit just bounces back up and then allows you to follow up on it. I'm not sure how many times you can do this before it will then like force you to kind of go into another part, but in this situation he does sort of like 3 big hits and does a sort of final like delivering blow. But either way, that is just like, I can kind of just sort of picture 4 hunters putting a monster in a trap and everyone just like smashing the hammer down on the monster's head, just kind of being absolutely hilarious. But either way, very cool weapon to use, great for KOing the monster. It does of course deal impact damage, and again, for those of you guys that are new to Monster Hunter, you typically have 2 main types of damage. You have cutting damage and impact. Cutting weapons can of course be used to sever tails, and they're also great at attacking certain parts of monsters. Meanwhile, impact style weapons, blunt weapons, they can't cut parts, but they can deal heavy damage to other parts of the monster, and they can also KO a monster. Then finally, under the heavy category, we have the heavy bowgun. Again, similar sort of story, sort of following this kind of third-person feel camera where you look a little bit more mobile. Obviously, you're slow with this. It is a heavier weapon, but you again aren't kind of rooted to the ground as you have been previously. You once again have a variety of different shots available to you. You can kind of sort of see this cluster sort of aerial missile. One of the interesting things here is you actually seem to be able to go prone, which is really, really cool. I'm not entirely sure why you want to do that in the game. I don't know whether there's like, you know, a benefit to it. Maybe like certain ammo types require you to lie down, or maybe there's like another reason that we just don't know about just yet, but that was kind of cool. We of course saw the Wyvern Fire attack, and again, if you've seen any of the previous gameplay, there is the ability to kind of unload into this Gatling mode if you have the right shot type. After that, moving over to the third and final category, the technical weapon type. This contains most of my favourite weapons. I'm going to kick things off with the Charge Blade, which is right up there at the top for me. I absolutely love this weapon. Of course, once I do eventually do my in-depth weapon tutorials, I will explain this far better. But if you guys are new to Monster Hunter, then Charge Blade is effectively both a sword and shield and also an axe. You can morph from sword and shield mode into axe mode, and it is probably one of the most complicated weapons in the game. It involves file management, building up your files, charging your files into your shield, transferring into your axe mode, and of course that then acts as your fuel to do things like your ultra attack. It sounds quite complicated, but it is a very awesome weapon. It of course also has access to guard points, which are another cool way of blocking and also dishing out damage. So there's lots and lots of stuff to factor in with this weapon, but if we focus specifically on what is shown in the gameplay, then to begin with, we of course see this standard charge attack. This is one of the greatest ways to kind of build up files for the attack. You charge your sword and you do like your standard upswing, downswing attack. However, what does appear to be new is that you can follow that with like a backwards sort of roundhouse, almost like backstep evade. In this situation, it's of course a great way to get out. So if you're then about to be hit, you can then backstep. You can of course then see they swap from sword and shield mode into axe mode and then use some of those files to dish out some more damage. Switching over from there to the next scene, you then have this cool slide attack. You'll see here how he slides along the ground and then does this sort of roundhouse spin. Now I'm not entirely sure whether that's what we saw just a moment ago, whether you can do this in like different angles or whatnot, but that in itself, if you can then kind of start combos, so you can go like slide into roundhouse into like charge attack, that could be pretty cool. And then of course to round out the segment, they then go into an ultra attack. So this is of course where you then use up your files, you use up the charge on your shield, you unleash all of that to then dish out a heavy megaton shockwave, which actually appears to have a pretty good range in this one. Of course in the past, depending on whether you were using like an impact style or an elemental style, then there are of course different shockwaves that come out. But in this situation, it lands, the initial impact clearly lands before the Great Jagras, but the shockwave that then comes out from that does the finishing blow. Moving on from there to the switch axe. Again, another one of those kind of slightly more complicated weapons. You can swap between sort of like a big sword form to an axe form. But there are some really cool moves here. So to begin with, they start in the axe mode, which is pretty standard. Then transition into the sword mode to do like a more familiar combo. And then going into, I typically refer to this as sort of like the chainsaw ultra move, just because it looks like you're sort of holding a chainsaw, but you effectively like unleash all your energy. But what's really new, and this is... this morning when these videos went live, this is probably where a lot of people lost their proverbial shit, so to speak. I don't swear, I apologise, but it's the best way to kind of explain it. This new move is really kind of crazy. So not only do we have a new move for the sword component, you have your first two swipes, but we then have this sort of underarm rising swipe, which has two parts to it. He has the jump attack and then a sort of swiping down attack. But following that, this is where things got crazy. Then goes into this discharge attack, but instead of it just kind of like going into the normal move where you then unload the energy, he actually mounts the monster, like grabs onto its head physically, unloads that attack, and then the explosion basically forces the hunter off. And you actually see at the very end, this is like, this attention to detail is crazy. The sword is slammed into the ground almost as if to slow him down because the impact just forced him back so hard. So that in itself, like I saw that and I was like, are you crazy? This is absolutely awesome. I love this bit. I use the switch axe for a fair bit in Generations. It's a really fun weapon to use. Again, it's slightly more technical, but it's really not that difficult to kind of get used to. And if I can do things like that, I am definitely totally and utterly on board. Moving on from there, we then have the Hunting Horn, of course, another impact style weapon. Now, there wasn't a great deal shown in this one, but Hunting Horn is... it's often referred to as a support weapon. It doesn't necessarily have to be seen as a support weapon. You can very much just use it as offensively as any other weapon, but the reason they typically lean towards that description is because the Hunting Horn allows you to play tunes which can then buff your teammates, so you can actually act as a support role. But one of the cool things in here is, of course, we see that when they're playing the songs, you can actually move ever so slightly, not like fluidly, so it's not like you can suddenly just sprint around whilst playing, but you do have the ability to slightly reposition yourself whilst you're playing your songs, which is going to be quite useful if you see an incoming attack. After that, we then have the bow. Now, again, we've seen a fair bit of this before in some of the Japanese gameplay, but it is a really, really cool weapon. We have this sort of slide that you can do, so you can kind of run from that into a slide and then go from there into like a charged attack. Once again, the charge, you sort of see this typical red glow that we've seen with the other weapons, so anytime you are charging, you'll see that envelop your bow. You can then also follow your sort of attacks with a dash to get a little bit closer to do like your split shot, and that can also work the opposite way, where you can sort of dash backwards if you want to go into like some slightly more powerful charge attacks. One of the really cool moves, and this is one of the new ones, and this is something that I saw like initially at E3 and was just like, what? This is crazy. Where you basically slide, you sort of charge your attacks, and then you draw an arrow and scrape it across the ground, and you then like set it alight and fire that into the monster. Now again, at this stage, I don't know whether that is just a simple explosion or whether there's actually an element tied to that. Maybe it mirrors the element of your bow, maybe it just has a fixed element, maybe it's just like explosive damage, but either way, it looks pretty sweet. And then finally, to round things out with another one of my favourite weapons. I appreciate I've said that a fair bit, but to clarify, Charge Blade, Insect Glaive, Switch Axe, probably three of my most favourite weapons. This one here is pretty cool. So Insect Glaive has, of course, always been a weapon which gives you the ability to launch yourself into the air. However, they seem to have kind of taken air mobility to the next level in World, because to begin with, you can then launch yourself in the typical way by vaulting off of your glaive. But following that, there's then like an in-air boost where you can then kind of like boost towards a monster. And if we then look at this scene, there appears to be 2 parts to it. You can boost like once and then twice. And the crazy thing is that following the sort of second attack that struck the monster, it then launched the hunter back up in the air, and they were then able to then dash again. Now, I don't know whether there's a limit to this. I imagine there probably is. I doubt they're going to kind of make it so you can just stay in the air for like the entire hunt and just like literally never touch the ground. So it's probably one of those things that you can only do like once or twice, but still, that is pretty cool. I mean, if a monster's running away and you want to pursue it, and you can then just, you know, like dash in the air after it, hit it, dash again. Or like, for example, if the monster moves around a little bit and you can use those dashes to like reposition instead of missing your attack, both of those are going to be pretty useful. We of course then get a demonstration of like typical Kinsect gatherings, so you know, like the Kinsect hits the head to get the red buff, the Kinsect hits like the stomach to get the white buff, so I'm assuming the triple buff is still, you know, there, and as it always has been, we get a look at like some standard combos, and that is pretty much it. So, that, my friends, apologies the video is a little bit long, but that was kind of a breakdown of what we've seen of all 14 weapons split into the kind of light, heavy, and technical categories. Definitely be sure to let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought. I will of course be going through this footage again over the coming days to talk about some other stuff, because we've seen some brand new armor sets in here that I do really want to talk about, because they potentially hint at, you know, returning monsters that we haven't yet seen. Of course, also some new monsters. Just in general, there's some really cool stuff to talk about, so expect some follow-up videos probably over the weekend. But for the time being, that is pretty much it. If you guys noticed anything that I didn't mention, then of course let me know. But right now I am definitely counting down the days to Gamescom. I know we've been wanting some new footage for a while, and of course now that I've seen all the weapons, it's just made me so much more excited. So Gamescom, don't forget, I'll be there going hands-on with the game, so I'll definitely want some there, but to bring you guys some information on all the weapons. I'm going to hope to kind of dive in and test out all 14, so hopefully in about 25 days, I should have a lot more information for you guys with regards to what's new with the weapons, what's changed, all that stuff. So keep it locked. But until then, thanks for watching, take it easy, catch you next time, peace out.